Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Bride's Happy Ever After Christmas by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. The snow crunched beneath her feet on the sidewalk, even as the wind sliced through her threadbare coat. It was February in New York, and winter had yet to relinquish its icy hold. Just the night before, winter had cursed the streets with 2 inches of snow. Usually the snow fascinated her, being that it represented somewhat of a new beginning. But that was just after it dusted the ground. Now, in the bright light of morning, with carriages and pedestrians making their way through the streets of New York, it became a muddy mess, the snow-white powder stained with dirt and grime. Jane Howard pulled her coat tighter around her waist and kept walking, refusing to compare herself with the snow, although in her mind the comparison had already been made. It would have been wiser to stay home in her tenement apartment this morning, especially since she didn't need to be at work until late afternoon, but Jane had an important errand to run, one that could change her whole future. She kept mucking through the snow and the dirt, ignoring the biting cold until she saw the street vendor in the distance. As if the cold didn't affect him at all, he stood beside his cart and waved a newspaper in the air. Extra! Extra! Read all about it. Today's news, fresh off the press. His voice could be heard from yards away as puffs of condensation escaped along with his words. Jane felt the excitement begin to rush through her veins. This wasn't the first time she was approaching the street vendor with a heart filled with hope. In fact, it would be the third time. Why this street vendor, you might ask? It was because this was the only one in the vicinity of her tenement apartment that sold the matrimonial times. Becoming a mail-order bride had been Jane's dream for months. Regardless of the exorbitant expense that came with purchasing the matrimonial times, she had yet to find a single advertisement that piqued her interest. Hopefully today would be different. It wasn't that Jane was trying to nitpick through the advertisements of the various men from across the country. It was merely a matter of knowing exactly what she wanted in a future husband. And she had yet to find just that. Good morning, miss. What'll be? The news from abroad? The news from the West Coast? Or might you perhaps be looking for love? The street vendor asked when Jane approached him. Jane blushed slightly, hoping no one could overhear their exchange. She had learned on her first visit to this street vendor that he didn't advertise selling the matrimonial times, leaving it rather to word of mouth through the women who supported him through the buying of the publication. The question was always, "Are you looking for love?" Jane nodded. "Love, please?" He reached beneath a stack of newspapers and pulled out the matrimonial times. Jane handed him the money and smiled at him shyly. "Thank you." "My pleasure, miss. May you find everything your heart desires and all you deserve," he said with a wink before he continued to call out to the passers-by. Extra! Extra! Read all about it." Jane quickly tucked the newspaper into her coat and began walking back to her apartment. She couldn't help but feel slightly foolish for purchasing it in the first place, especially for a third time. The poor street vendor must think her desperate, she thought with a heavy sigh. If certain people were to see her now, she could already imagine the judgment that would show in their eyes. But she no longer associated with those people. In fact, she hadn't seen any of them in months, not since the funeral. Jane no longer moved in those circles or within that side of town. She didn't miss the people or the elite side of town, but she did miss having a home. She missed feeling as if she belonged. Her life had become no more than a constant struggle, a reminder of all the mistakes she had made and the past she couldn't change. But hopefully, the newspaper tucked into her coat would change all that. Perhaps she might find hope again, but it had to be with the right man. Jane once thought she had found the right man, but how wrong she had been. It had been a hard lesson to learn, and one she would never forget. But finding the right man was harder than she had thought it could be. She approached the rundown building in which she now rented a tenement apartment and let out a heavy sigh. The building represented her feelings: run down, tired, forgotten, and broken. Some of its tenants believed this was a temporary home until they found the way to their fortune. Others, like Jane, just wished they could be anywhere else. But Jane couldn't afford other lodgings. For now, her home was this musty, moldy apartment with paint peeling off the walls and rain pouring in through the numerous leaks from above. Along with the fireplace that did nothing but shroud the entire apartment in smoke, there was the broken window that she had attempted to seal up with boards of wood. The apartment was just as cold as Jane's heart had become, and just as desperate. She took out the matrimonial Times and placed it on her bed before she tugged off her boots. They had seen better days over the many years. Now they barely kept out the cold with the water and snow that seeped through the cracks. Jane rubbed her cold feet back to life, wondering if this would be the day that she finally found the right man, the one she had been praying for. Chapter 2. With the feeling returning to her numbed feet after donning 3 pairs of socks, all she owned, in fact, Jane padded over to the wood stove to put on a pot of tea. Although she had been eager to buy the Matrimonial Times this morning, she couldn't help but feel anxious about reading it. What if she didn't find the right man inside its pages? Would she be able to survive another winter, another year in New York? Jane sliced a piece of bread and ate it dry while she waited for the tea to brew. Leaning her hip against the kitchen cupboard, she found herself thinking back to her life just a few years ago. It had been the summer of '86, and Jane had never been more terrified or excited in her whole life. She was barely 18 years old, and regardless of being an orphan and alone, she had dreams that kept her warm at night. She had worked as a server at every inn that would take her, trying to save up for her first apartment. She slept on benches, on friends' sofas, and even beneath a bridge once. But to Jane, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she had her whole life ahead of her. Jane could still remember that stifling hot evening late in July when she'd worked at an inn on the elite side of town. A friend had asked her to come in after a server had come down with the flu. That summer, the flu had taken many lives in New York. But Jane didn't allow herself to dwell on that. Instead, she thought back to the evening she met Daniel Abernathy. The inn had been more upmarket than any she had served in before, the clientele even more so. Even without knowing anyone's names, Jane could see she was in the company of elite society. The women wore pearls and diamonds, and the men drank straight scotch and smoked thick cigars. The scent of French perfume mingled with cigar smoke was something she would always remember about that night. Daniel Abernathy wasn't even seated in her section that evening. She had simply followed the barman's order to take another round to his table. Jane failed to notice the walking stick leaning against the table until she tripped over it. Instead of serving Daniel Abernathy his drink, she had spilled it all over him. She had expected to be fired on the spot or to be scolded and belittled by the rich gentleman. Instead, he had smiled and helped her to her feet before introducing himself. That night, Jane had left with her wages and an invitation to join Daniel for dinner the following night. Although he was older than her, 15 years to be exact, it didn't matter to Jane. He was charming and rich, and he made her feel as if she really mattered. To Daniel, she was the beautiful, young, orphaned woman he could protect and present like a trophy on his arm. To Jane, Daniel was a generous and kind man who provided a home and cared for her. They had married before the summer was over. Jane went from sleeping on benches to living on the Upper East Side, from threadbare and torn clothing to the most exquisite dresses and hats. It was as if she had become a real-life Cinderella. They were guests at lavish dinners and opulent balls, and Daniel made sure she had everything her heart desired. Their first year of marriage had been the best year of Jane's life. If only she had opened her eyes now and then to look at her husband without rose-tinted glasses, she might have noticed the warning signs sooner. Little by little, he began to distance himself from her. He would come home drunk, stinking of cheap scent, and slur his way into the brownstone. On those nights, Jane preferred the spare bedroom to her own room. As the financial markets changed, the drinking became worse. It changed Daniel, Or perhaps it revealed the man he had been hiding all along. His insults would sting for days afterward. But the drunken insults Jane could still overlook. It was the sober comments that broke her heart. Whereas once she had been his angel, the love of his life, and the stars in his night sky, as he once aptly put it, she became the chain around his neck, the orphan sucking at the rear teat, his charity case. By the third year, Jane desperately wanted to divorce Daniel. She knew it would ruin her reputation, but she couldn't spend the rest of her life with a man prone to drinking and insults. Besides, deep down, she knew that soon it wouldn't stop at that. His temper had worsened, his fists clenching at his sides whenever he arrived home drunk. Jane refused to be around when the day dawned that his fists were no longer just clenching at his sides. On the very same day, she had an appointment with an attorney to help rid herself of the nightmare her marriage had become. A messenger arrived at the house just as Jane had been about to leave. The news, albeit horrible, had been a relief. Daniel had suffered a fatal heart attack in his office that morning. She was his sole heir. Jane's relief was short-lived. As soon as the funeral was behind her, the estate attorney revealed the cold, hard facts to Jane. Although her husband had given the appearance of wealth, there was in fact no money left in his estate. The house had been leased and had never actually belonged to him. What money he did have covered all his debt, leaving Jane with a little more than a month's wages. She had found a tenement apartment the following day and began searching for work as a server the next. In the blink of an eye, she had lost her comfortable life of wealth and privilege, and quite fortunately, the horrible man who had given her all that in the first place, too. For the last 6 months, she had worked a shift every night, some days even 2. The plan had been to save enough money to escape New York and the horrible memories it held. But the wages were low, and with the cost of living and the rent for her apartment, it might be years before she saved enough. That's when the idea occurred to her to become a mail-order bride. The thought of marrying again scared her, but to the right man, she hoped her second marriage would be different. She wanted a home, a man who loved and appreciated her, and most of all, she dreamed of having a family. And she wanted none of that in New York. Her eyes fell on the matrimonial times on her bed, and she prayed that today would be the day that she would unearth the right man from between its pages. Chapter 3. After returning from her shift at the inn, Jane was tired. She had been on her feet all night, and it didn't help that she had a table of dock workers. She had to ignore their lewd comments and invitations all night, and they had barely left her a decent tip. This wasn't what she wanted to be doing for the rest of her life. She had spent the afternoon browsing through the matrimonial times, but had seen no suitable man with whom to correspond. All the advertisements she had read were either from men who were too desperate, too old, or simply searching for a nanny whom they would not have to pay. Jane bathed and changed into her nightclothes before she slipped into bed. She said her prayers and found herself still wide awake. Hoping she had missed something, she lit a candle and reached for the matrimonial times once more. This time she didn't skim over the pages. Instead, she read every advertisement carefully. Some of the advertisements simply broke her heart. Men who had found love only to have lost it, and now were lonely and simply seeking companionship. A yawn escaped her as she turned the page and began reading from the top left corner. Her eyes were starting to droop, sleep lulling her closer, but Jane kept reading. A frown creased her brow as she read an advertisement she had missed earlier that afternoon. She shot upright in bed and read it again. Shop owners seeking what can't be bought. Jack Morrow, 25, is the sole owner of the mercantile store in Winter Creek, Colorado. As a successful businessman, Jack is used to acquiring what his heart desires, but certain things can't be bought, like the love and loyalty of a lady. In his own words, Jack describes his future wife as being of sound mind and body and possessing kindness and generosity. He seeks a lady who will open her heart to love, a woman he can build a future with and hopefully one day have a family with. Jack believes that hard work results in success, and with the right woman, he wants to make a success of his marriage. He describes himself as being fair, generous, and caring, and vows to uphold these qualities in a relationship. If you feel that you are the woman Jack is seeking, you can reach out to him at the following postal address. Jane felt her heart swell with hope as she read the advertisement for a third time. She hadn't held much hope when she had opened the newspaper that night, but now she knew she had found the man she was looking for. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream of becoming a mercantile's wife and found a smile curving her mouth. Jane loved working with people, and she knew she would find joy in assisting the townfolk in the store. Over the last few months, she had been praying for this moment every single night, and now that she had finally found the man with whom she wanted to correspond, she wasn't sure what she should say. Jane threw back the covers and climbed out of bed. She returned a few minutes later with a writing pad and began to write the letter she hoped would change the course of her life, the letter that would finally help her to escape New York. Dear Mr. Morrow, I hope this letter finds you in good health. My name is Jane Howard. I am 23 years of age and currently residing in New York. I read your advertisement in the Matrimonial Times and found myself compelled to reach out to you. There is so much more I would like to learn about you and the town in which you live, but before I indulge in my curiosity, let me tell you about me. I am a widow, having married at a very young age. Although my husband was charming once, he became a slave to the bottle, and the ensuing years were not as wonderful as I had hoped. Our wealth seemed to be superfluous as well. It was only after the funeral that I learned of his debt. I gave up my way of life and my home, and now live in a tenement apartment, working as a server in inns around the neighborhood. I do not share any of this with you in the hopes of gaining your sympathy, but rather to give a clear picture of who I am and to give you an idea of my past. Hard work has never frightened me, and neither has serving customers on my feet for hours on end. I too believe in qualities such as fairness, generosity, and loyalty. After following my heart once and having it broken, I must admit I am a little anxious to give it away again. But that doesn't stop me from dreaming about a future with a loving and kind husband and a family to call our own. I truly hope that you will engage in correspondence with me, as I am eager to hear from you and about the town you call home. Kindest regards, Jane Howard. Jane placed the letter on her bedside table, vowing to mail it first thing in the morning. When she fell asleep, it was with a smile on her face, and she dreamed of a life in Winter Creek with a husband named Jack Morrow. Chapter 4. Jack Morrow unlocked the front door of the mercantile store and flipped the sign from closed to open. It was a bright morning with a flurry of clouds overhead, but the cool air coming off the mountains still encouraged the wearing of a coat. He glanced at the number of boxes that could be seen in the back room and let out a sigh. He would get to unpacking the boxes, just like he would get to dusting the shelves. These days, it was hard for him to get everything done. The shop had quickly expanded from its beginnings to where it was now. Jack had considered hiring some help, but it simply didn't feel right. It would feel as if he was replacing his parents. His thoughts were interrupted when the bells jingled on the door and Billy walked in with the morning's mail. "Mornin', Jack. The mail came in on last night's train." "Mornin', Billy," Jack greeted the station master. "Are you in a hurry, or would you mind pigeonholing the mail for me?" "Sure thing, if that means I can get a cup of coffee out to you." Billy moved around the counter to the mail pigeonholes. Every pigeonhole had the name of a resident in the town beneath it. Before the mail pigeonholes were placed inside the mercantile store, they were housed on the boardwalk on the thoroughfare. But rain, wind, and dust had caused too many letters to be blown away or damaged before they could be retrieved by their owners. Jack didn't mind having the pigeonholes in his store. For him, it meant more feet, which meant more business. "I'll go get that coffee." Jack headed into the back room where the coffee was brewing on the potbelly stove. He usually started a pot long before he opened the store in the mornings. It made it easier since he lived in the house beside the store. When he returned, Billy held an envelope up in the air. "Letter for you, Jack? All the way from New York." Jack frowned. "New York?" Billy chuckled. "Must be that bride you've been waiting for." Jack and Billy had been friends ever since Jack and his parents moved to town. They were almost the same age and got along very well. Billy had a sweetheart he adored, and it had been his idea for Jack to seek out a mail-order bride. In Winter Creek, there weren't many young women of his age available, and Jack didn't have the time or the inclination to take off for months to travel east in the hopes of finding love. Must be. He set the letter aside and turned to Billy, vowing he'd read it the moment Billy left. Anything interesting arrive on the train this morning? Just a piano. Seems the fundraising paid off. The church's piano finally arrived. Still need to go and grab a few men to help me get it to the church when I'm done here. Jack nodded with a smile. Winter Creek had that admirable quality about it in that the community members worked together, no matter how big or how small the task at hand. I have some boxes to unpack, shelves to dust, and then of course it's Thursday, Billy laughed. Let me guess, Mrs. Thompson's list? Yup, Jack nodded. Ever since first opening the mercantile store, Mrs. Thompson had her neighbor's boy drop off a list every Thursday. Being a widow and quite elderly, Jack didn't mind boxing up her list and delivering it to her door. He offered this extra service happily. Well, I've got to go get that piano moving. But you tell me later what that letter said, yeah? I will. Jack waved his friend goodbye and opened the letter from New York. As he read, he found himself both intrigued and fascinated by the letter writer. Her honesty was refreshing. He couldn't help but admire her strength at having suffered such a horrible marriage and then being widowed without a dime. Procedieth delps by percent. It took courage to start over and even more to be a server in the establishments of New York. Jack didn't know much about Jane, but he did know there was something about her that made him want to hear from her again. He wasn't sure that she was the woman with whom he was going to find love, but he at least had to give it a chance. Ignoring the boxes and the shelves waiting to be dealt with, Jack reached for his stationery and began to write. Dear Jane, my first thought when I read your letter was how refreshing your honesty came across. It isn't every day a woman would admit to having suffered a failed marriage or having to work as a server at an inn. A vocation I've heard can be very taxing, especially for a young lady. To repay your honesty, I'll tell you a little more about myself. I grew up in Chicago in a loving home. My parents always owned a mercantile store in the city. On my 18th birthday, they declared their dreams of seeing the country. The plan was to travel through the West and open as many mercantile stores as we could before selling them on to a local owner. Instead, we fell in love with the very first town we came across. We opened the mercantile store in Winter Creek exactly 4 years ago. Together, my parents and I grew it from a few shelves stocking mostly essentials to a variety store that now sells everything from coal to Christmas stockings. It is my pride and my joy. But 6 months ago, everything changed. My father came down with a terrible fever, and while caring for him, my mother contracted the illness. They passed within a week of each other, for which I am certain they are grateful. Their love and commitment to each other was admirable, and I hope to one day experience the same for myself. On my own now, I've come to realize how lonely I am, how I yearn for a companion. It was my friend who suggested I place an advertisement, although I never thought I might find someone with whom I wished to correspond until I read your letter. I hope to hear from you again soon. Kind regards, Jack Morrow. Chapter 5. Jane had waited all day to read Jack's letter. It had arrived shortly before she left for her shift at the inn, and instead of rushing through it immediately, she had saved it to read when she got home. Walking home from the diner, the air was stifling, and it was almost suffocatingly humid and hot. It had been one of the hottest summers in recent memory in New York. The heat Jane could endure, but she could come to terms with the stench of rotting food, manure, and sewerage that caught in her nostrils and her throat. Although New York as a city was way ahead of its time, its constantly growing population brought about real problems that had to be addressed. Every day, more ships arrived carrying hopeful foreigners, eager to follow their dreams in the land they had heard was paved with gold. But as excited as these foreigners were to follow their dreams in New York, Jane's dreams had moved on to grow elsewhere. In a little town by the name of Winter Creek in Colorado, For the last 6 months, she and Jack had been in regular correspondence. His letters became more personal and more insightful every time she read them. Without realizing it, she had felt herself start to fall in love with a man she had never even met. A man who seemed to understand and accept her for who she was. In her last letter to Jack, she had told him more about New York. She had told him about the docks, the bridges, and even about 5 Points and the local gangs that had formed there. Although Jane lived a few blocks from 5 Points, she could still hear the arguments and fights late at night when she walked home. Another reason she wanted to escape New York. As soon as she arrived at her apartment, Jane headed to the letter she had left on her bed. With excitement, she ripped it open and began to devour Jack's words. My dearest Jane, I have heard many times of the wonders of New York, but to see it through your eyes makes me think differently of it. I can't help but think of it as a place of broken dreams, desperation, and greed, very much like Chicago had become in our last years there. That must be why I find myself grateful to live in Winter Creek. If you'll allow me, let me take you on a walk through my little town. When you approach the town by train, it looks like just a strip of dust with a spattering of weathered buildings. But around the buildings and beyond the strip of dust are fields and pastures as far as the eye can see. Some mountains touch the clouds and streams trickle as clear as glass. On arrival at the train platform, you'll get your first real view of the thoroughfare. It's the beating heart of our little town. To the left, you'll see the barber shop, the candy store, and the latest arrival in town, a boutique dress store. To your right, you'll find the sheriff's office and the livery, and in the far distance, you'll see the steeple of the church, which recently acquired a new piano. But directly across from the train platform is a building trimmed in bright red. Large windows reveal the magic inside, and a bell on the door welcomes visitors as soon as they cross the threshold. Of course, that would be my mercantile store. Instead of the stench that you suffer on summer evenings in the city, in Colorado, you get to hear the hum of sun beetles and cicadas. You can smell the honeysuckle that flourishes in the pastor's garden and the fresh mountain air blowing in off the mountain. A walk wouldn't be hazarded by any gangs of New York. Instead, you'd be greeted by everyone you pass. Because in a small town like Winter Creek, everyone knows everyone. On Sundays, the church service is attended by mostly everyone in town, and afterwards, you're invited to join the congregation for a picnic beside the pond. On most Sundays, I indulge simply in the feast of salads that are brought along. Of course, I do my part by spoiling all the children with candy. But the best part about living in Winter Creek for me is to sit on my porch late at night. My house is adjacent to the mercantile store, looking out over the street behind it. I can sit there for hours and look at the stars and dream of my future. Dreams that have started to include you. With nothing but the quiet and the dark to keep me company, the moon lights up the night sky and creates a magical Winter Creek that only night owls can see. I hope to share this with you one day. In our last correspondence, you mentioned wanting to be a mother. Have you given any thought to the number of children you would like? As for me, I'd like to have at least 3. Affectionate regards, Jack. Jane let out a quiet sigh, feeling almost sentimental about his letter. How she would love to walk through Winter Creek. How she would enjoy smelling the honeysuckle and seeing the town by the light of the moon. A tear slipped over her cheek, not one of sadness, but one of joyous hope that one day soon she would travel to Winter Creek to build a new life. Chapter 6. Jane couldn't help but feel a little low as she unlocked the door to her apartment. The temperature inside her apartment barely differed from the cold outside. She didn't even bother taking off her coat, knowing she would only search for it within minutes if she did. The hole in the window still hadn't been replaced by the landlord, and the leaks in the roof had yet to be attended to. She stopped just beyond the doorway and glanced around at the dank and desperate apartment and wondered if she would be able to survive another winter within its desolate walls. For a while, she had honestly believed that a proposal was imminent from Jack Morrow. They had corresponded almost bi-weekly until a little over a month ago. At first, Jane had reasoned that the letter she had expected to receive by now must have been lost in the mail, but after 2 weeks of waiting, the doubt began to crawl closer. Perhaps Jack Morrow had lost interest and decided not to continue his correspondence after all. Besides, what did she have to offer a man like Jack Morrow? He was successful, independent, handsome, and from what she could tell by his letters, very charming. Any woman would be lucky to have a man like Jack Morrow show an interest, which gave Jack Morrow little reason to consider looking at her twice. Jane didn't doubt that she was attractive in a rather usual sort of way, but she did have a past. She might not have gone so far as to file for divorce, but she was a widow, a penniless widow serving at an inn on the wrong side of the tracks in the city of New York. No wonder Jack Morrow had stopped writing to her. He'd probably seen the error of his ways and found someone more suitable with whom to correspond. A heavy sigh escaped Jane as she sat down on her bed. She had come to dream of a life in Winter Creek, a life with Jack Morrow, and just as quickly as those dreams had started to take shape, they were crushed by Jack's silence. 6 weeks and not a single letter. Not even a goodbye. Out of desperation, she had considered writing to Jack again a couple of weeks ago, but she held her pride in check. If Jack had moved on, she didn't want his last memories of her to be a desperate attempt to regain his interest. A tear slipped over Jane's cheek, wondering what would become of her. Would she grow old alone or hopefully pass away in her sleep from the cold before she had to face a lifetime of hardships? There was a brief knock at her door, which startled her because of the late hour being that the clock was moving towards 11. A frown creased Jane's brow as she stood up and moved towards the door. She opened it barely a crack and recognized her neighbor from 3 doors down. "Molly, goodness, is something wrong?" Jane asked, opening the door wider. The poor woman looked even more fretful than usual, but that was to be expected when raising 4 children alone while her husband worked long shifts at the docks. "Oh, Jane, I'm so desperately sorry. I should have noticed it sooner. But it wasn't until this evening that I cleaned out the chest and found it," Molly said apologetically. "Molly, slow down. What are you talking about?" Jane asked, inviting Molly in out of the cold. "It's Benjamin, you see. He's been acting up these last few months. First it was a sock here and there from a laundry line, then it was toys from his friends, but I never expected him to take this." Molly held up 3 envelopes. "What's that?" Jane asked, taking a step backward, confused. "It's letters, your letters. It seems Benjamin has been nicking mail from the neighbors' porches as well. His pa gave him a good talking to, but that doesn't fix what he's done. I'm so sorry, Jane. I really hope that it wasn't anything urgent." Molly held out the letters. "I'll get out of your hair now, but truly, Jane, I am desperately sorry for what Benjamin did." Molly let herself out while Jane stood in place, dumbstruck, holding the letters she thought Jack had never bothered to write. Her heart was beating a mile a minute, hope blooming in her chest, that just perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps Jack hadn't lost interest in her at all. Instead of reading the letters in the order they had been sent, she ripped open the most recently mailed envelope and held her breath as she began to read. "My dearest Jane, it has been a month since I heard from you. 4 weeks of thinking about you. 30 days of constant concern about your health, and countless hours of wishing for a letter from you every day. I have come to accept that either something dreadful has happened or you have had a change of heart. If it is the latter, I truly hope you find joy and love in your future. If something dreadful has indeed happened, then I accept I won't ever hear from you again. I also won't attempt to bother you again, but allow my heart to plead for the very last time. When I received your first letter, I never considered that one could fall in love through words alone. How wrong I had been, and how foolish. Through your words, I have found myself falling deeper and deeper in love with you with every single letter. My heart opened itself to a kind and generous woman with a heart of gold. My mind allowed itself to dream of a future with this wonderful woman. I miss you, Jane. I miss your stories about New York. I miss your descriptions. And most of all, I miss having the certainty that you care for me as deeply as I care for you. If you do receive this letter, I hope it awakens the same dreams in your heart. dreams for our future together in Winter Creek. Since I cannot ask you this in person, I shall write this on bended knee. Jane Howard, would you please do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you join me in Winter Creek to build a life together and to raise a family together? I promise to honor, cherish, and love you for all the days of my life. I truly hope to hear from you soon, and I will be praying that your answer is yes. Yours truly, Jack Morrow. Jane gasped as happy tears flowed from her eyes. Jack hadn't forgotten about her. She sniffed away the tears and began to plan her trip to the West. She had saved up for the day that Jack's proposal finally came, and now that it was here, she had only a few things to take care of before she was at liberty to board a train to the West. But first, she would pen a reply to Jack Morrow. Chapter 7. Winter Creek was even lovelier than Jack had described in his letters, was the first thought that occurred to Jane as the train came to a stop. After 3 days of traveling, she was grateful her journey had come to an end, but she was also anxious to finally meet Jack Morrow. She gathered her carpet bag and moved towards the front of the train to disembark, realizing she was the only person leaving the train at this stop. The conductor had already retrieved her luggage from the luggage carriage at the previous town to have it ready when they arrived in Winter Creek. He set the trunk down on the station platform and tipped his hat with a toothless smile. "Best of luck, miss." "Thank you." Jane smiled at him and waved as he climbed back onto the train. The train's whistle sounded, and the next moment, the train began to roll away. Fear and excitement coursed through Jane's veins as she watched it move further and further away from her. "Jane?" She turned at the sound of her name and found a very handsome, tall man smiling at her. For a moment, Jane couldn't seem to string two words together. He had kind brown eyes and a very charming smile. Jane's heart skipped a beat. Through the letters, she had come to feel as if she knew Jack Morrow personally. But standing in front of him now, she realized he was but a stranger to her. "Jane, are you all right? You've turned white as a sheet," Jack asked, concerned, reaching for her elbow as if she were about to fall at any moment. Jane blinked rapidly and shook her head before summoning a smile. "I'm just a little worn out from the traveling." She held out her hand and met Jack's gaze. "Jane Howard, it's a pleasure to meet you." Jack chuckled. "Jack Morrow, it's a pleasure to meet you too." For a moment, neither knew what to do next, looking at one another in silent contemplation, both curiously assessing their future life partner. After a few moments, Jack glanced at the trunk at her feet. "Is that your only luggage?" "Yes, indeed it is. I traveled light," Jane said lightly, although that trunk contained all her worldly possessions. She glanced across the street and smiled when she saw the mercantile store. "Your store, it's exactly where you said it would be." "It is, yes, and so is the chapel where the pastor is waiting to wed us," Jack replied with a smile. Jane's eyes widened. "Goodness, I completely forgot that we were to be wed on my arrival. Could I just freshen up somewhere before we do?" Jack nodded as he led her towards his wagon. "There's a powder room at the chapel." As they drove along the thoroughfare, Jane recognized all the places Jack had mentioned in his letters. The chapel was white, just as he'd said, with a tall steeple. After a quick introduction to the pastor, Jane was shown to the powder room. She stood in front of the mirror and adjusted her hair, feeling more nervous than she had anticipated. In a few minutes, she would no longer be Jane Howard. She would become Mrs. Jack Morrow. She smoothed her hands down her dress and took a deep breath before adjusting her hair one final time. She wanted to look perfect for the start of her perfect life. The pastor was a kindly, elderly gentleman who seemed not in the least concerned that Jane was a mail-order bride. He welcomed her as if he'd known her for years. Their only witnesses were to be the pianist and the groundskeeper, two more strangers who welcomed Jane as if she were family. Before she knew it, the pastor reached the important part. He smiled at Jane and asked her the question she had answered once before in her life. "Do you take this man as your lawful husband? Do you promise to honor and obey him all the days of your life?" "I do," Jane said in a quiet voice. Plus and percent. He turned to Jack and asked him similarly. Jack's smile broadened as he held Jane's gaze. "I do with all my heart." The pastor smiled brightly. I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jane searched her husband's eyes and wondered if she would truly find happiness with him in Winter Creek. Or would the dark shadows of her past seep into her new life, just like the cold had seeped into her tenement apartment? She quickly pushed the thought aside, not wanting Jack to pick up on her doubts, and then she followed her husband, who was really but a stranger, out of the chapel. "Ready to see your new home, Mrs. Morrow?" Jack asked as he helped her onto the wagon. Jane laughed at his charming way with words. "I'd love to, Mr. Morrow." Chapter 8. Jane looked at the charming cabin that was to be her home and smiled as the wagon came to a stop. "Welcome home," Jack said, climbing down from the wagon. "The house backs onto the mercantile store. It's not much, but it's home." "It looks lovely," Jane commented, accepting his hand as he helped her down from the wagon. The adjoining porch appeared just large enough for two to sit and overlook the mountains in the distance. The window boxes beneath the windows now contained only dirt, but Jane could imagine them spilling over with flowers in the summertime. She followed Jack inside and couldn't help but smile. Emotion welled up in her eyes, but she blinked the tears away. There had been a time when she'd lived in a luxurious brownstone in uptown New York, followed recently by the years living in the dank and moldy tenement apartment near 5 Points. But neither of those places had ever felt like home. Just standing in Jack's living room, she already felt as if she'd finally arrived home. The house was cozy and small, as Jack had warned her. You could see the wood stove from the front door as well as the kitchen table. To the right were two doors which Jane presumed to be the bedrooms. Jack cleared his throat as if he himself was a little emotional. "There's the kitchen. This is the living room, and the door on the left opens onto my bedroom. I fixed up the other bedroom for you. As I mentioned in our letters, nothing is expected of you beyond companionship. You'll have more privacy in your own room, which I hope makes you a little more comfortable." Jane nodded gratefully. "Thank you. That was very thoughtful of you." She followed Jack, who was carrying her trunk, to her new bedroom. When Jack opened the door, she couldn't help but be surprised by how spacious the room was. It was the size of her entire apartment in New York. Noticing her surprise, Jack explained, "When my parents had the house built, they made sure we each had our own private space. Working together and living with your parents can make for a testy atmosphere every so often." He shrugged with a smile. "This used to be my room." Jane smiled at him. "It's truly lovely, Jack." The bed was covered in a beautiful handmade quilt. Soft linens hung in front of the windows, gently moving in the breeze. But not because there was a hole in the window, simply because Jack had opened it to air out the room. In the corner, a dresser stood beside a wardrobe. The dresser boasted 3 drawers and held a vase of flowers. It was a small touch that meant so very much to Jane. "Thank you, Jack," Jane said, turning to him. Before considering her actions, she embraced him with excitement. She quickly stepped back, her cheeks flushing bright red. "I'm sorry. That was very forward of me. Please forgive me." "Nothing to forgive," Jack smiled kindly, although it was evident in his expression that the hug had caught him by surprise. "I'll let you settle in and find your way around the house without me hovering about. I've got to get back to the store, but I'll see you tonight?" Jane nodded. "Thank you again, Jack." Jack held her gaze. "Thank you for coming." Jane stood for a few moments in her new room, appreciating how blessed she was to have found Jack and to now be his wife. Wanting to settle in before she rested a while, she began to unpack her trunk and carpet bag. There was more than enough space for all her belongings, leaving room in both the wardrobe and the dresser. When she was done in her room, she closed the window and shut out the cold for good before she headed to the kitchen. The kitchen was practical and very functional, offering all that Jane hadn't had in her own apartment. It was only then that she saw the magnificent wood stove. It was the newest model she had ever seen and had place for 5 pots, as well as a pot of coffee or tea. The oven was large enough to hold a large cut of meat for roasting. She opened the furnace door and added 2 pieces of wood to the embers. Jane was pleasantly surprised to find a small pantry beside the kitchen, stocked with everything she could possibly dream of, making her tummy rumble with hunger. She hadn't eaten very well on the train and could now feel the hunger sneaking up on her. But before she would spoil herself with a home-cooked meal, there was more to explore. She opened the back door and found a small courtyard between the house and the back of the store, boasting a table and 2 chairs and reminding her of an inviting haven of privacy, something she hadn't had much of in recent years. At the back door, she noticed a crate of firewood and smiled happily, realizing it was for the fireplace. Tears of relief and joy quietly slipped over her cheeks as Jane realized that this wouldn't be a cold winter. This winter she would rest easy with a full belly, in a warm bed, and knowing that someone cared for her. She allowed herself to savor the thought for a few moments before she stepped back inside into the welcoming warmth of the house. Knowing she couldn't keep thanking Jack over and over again, she decided to show her gratitude through her actions instead. During her marriage to Daniel, she had spent a lot of time in the kitchen to avoid the loneliness of the solitude. Those hours in the kitchen had taught her so much about cooking, and tonight she wanted to impress her new husband with her culinary skills. That was the least she could do after all he had already done for her. Chapter 9. After a long day at the store, Jack crossed the small courtyard where the delicious aroma of roast beef assailed his senses even before he stepped into the house through the back door. Jack couldn't help but be pleased by how well Jane had settled into his home, their home. A little more than a week after her arrival in Winter Creek, she seemed positively comfortable around him and in his home. During those first few days, she had seemed a little anxious and easily startled, but she no longer jumped at the sound of his voice. She now greeted him with a smile whenever he came in through the door. She had surprised him every night with a delightful home-cooked meal. What had surprised Jack even more than her cooking was her eagerness to work. He had insisted she settle in before she began to help him in the mercantile store. Instead of settling in and taking things slow while she adjusted to her new life and role as wife, Jane had taken to cleaning the house from top to bottom. His windows had never before sparkled the way they did after Jane had scrubbed them down with vinegar, of all things. The floors had been scrubbed and oiled, and so had the windowsills. There wasn't a spider web or speck of dust to be seen. Jane had even unpacked the entire pantry and cleaned every shelf before restocking it, according to a system that Jack had yet to understand. The icebox in the pantry had also undergone a thorough cleaning, causing Jack to realize that things had been slipping around the house since his mother passed. It wasn't that the house had been dirty in any way. It was simply that a woman looked at things differently than a man. Although their conversations still felt a little stilted, Jack hoped that in time Jane would feel as comfortable expressing her thoughts and feelings to him in person as she had in her letters. He stopped at the wood crate and piled a few logs into the crook of his arm to carry them inside. A smile curved his mouth at the sight of Jane setting the table for their meal, as she did every night. It was such a homely gesture that it made Jack's heart swell with hope that one day the table would host their children as well. "Good evening. The roast smells delicious," Jack gushed, placing the logs beside the fireplace. "It is a good evening." Jane smiled at him from the dining table. "I managed to roast the beef without turning it to coal." Her soft laughter filled the house. "From what I've tasted of your cooking, I doubt you're capable of reducing any dish to cinders." Jane cocked a brow as she moved to the stove to pour him a cup of coffee, as she did every night when he returned home from the store. "Believe me, I am more than capable. If I'm cooking too extravagantly, you should tell me, Jack. I'm having so much fun cooking on that lovely wood stove that I tend to lose track of what is necessary and what isn't." Jack laughed. "Believe me, your cooking is a necessity every night. It's a good thing I have so many deliveries arriving at the store. Without the exercise, I'd probably gain 10 pounds before Christmas dawns." "About the store," Jane began hesitantly. "I know you said that you wanted me to settle in before I began to help you in the store, but honestly, there is only so much cleaning I can do. Do you think I might be able to join you in the store tomorrow?" Jack smiled as Jane tugged at her hair. She had the cute habit of always making sure her hair was in place whenever he was around. "Tomorrow? Are you sure? I sure could use the help, but I don't want to overwhelm you. You'll be doing me a favor. I'm used to working at least 7 hours a day. Spending time in your home has been a lovely reprieve, but I miss feeling useful. Firstly, our home. Secondly, you are useful in our home. And thirdly, if you'd like to help me in the store, I'd appreciate it very much. But I don't want you to spend all your time slaving away in the store. You have a husband now, one who would like to at least feel as if he's caring and providing for you." Jane laughed. "Jack, don't be ridiculous. Of course you are. How about we come to an agreement? I'll help you in the store until after lunch every day. Then I'll come home and cook dinner and tend to the housekeeping chores." "That sounds like a perfect marriage." Jack smiled at her from across the table. "Besides, I'm excited for my customers to meet you. Everyone is very curious about my new bride, especially since I've been too selfish to introduce her to anyone just yet." A light blush colored Jane's cheeks. "I'd like to meet them as well. It's a good thing we're already married. I have a feeling there are going to be a few jealous men around town once they meet my beautiful wife." Jack complimented her with honesty because to him, Jane was truly beautiful. "Let me carve the roast. You seem on the verge of becoming delirious with hunger," Jane teased him before she pulled the roast out of the oven. Jack watched her and couldn't help but feel affection swell in his heart. He knew that there was a great deal he didn't know about Jane, especially about her younger years and where she had been raised. In their letters, she had spoken about her marriage and the last 2 years, but hardly ever about her childhood. There was so much more he wanted to learn about his new wife, but he knew patience was key. The way to build a solid foundation for their life together was to let one another reveal themselves in their own time. And Jack had nothing but time. Chapter 10. Yesterday I showed you where we stock the candy, the tinned food, and the Christmas ornaments. Today I'm going to show you how we display the items that are a little more interesting, such as ribbons, cotton thread, and of course the new bolts of fabric we just received yesterday from Chicago, Jack explained over a cup of coffee in the front of the store. The day before had gone surprisingly well. Jane had accomplished more in less time than any assistant Jack had ever considered hiring in the past. She was meticulous and thorough with every task he had given her. Fabric from Chicago? I imagine the ladies are very fond of you for ordering fabric from so far away? Jane asked curiously. Jack nodded. I only started stocking fabric a year ago after one of my customers requested it. No, but I soon learned that ordering a large quantity brings down the cost per yard if you take the delivery costs into account. That makes sense, Jane nodded. Another thing I'd like to teach you today is how the mail pigeonholes work behind the counter. When the mail comes in, it gets pigeonholed for each address or household in town. Whenever someone comes in to collect their mail, they sign for it in a ledger. Jack pulled out a ledger from beneath the counter. This is just to make sure no one can complain that they didn't get their mail. That's very clever. It works. Now you'll soon get to know the customers by name, but until then, just double-check before you give them their mail. I will. But I'm sure you'll introduce me? Jane asked hesitantly. Of course I will, but sometimes, especially at this time of the year, the store can get quite busy. During those times, I might not be able to introduce you. Jane nodded. When will you teach me the different prices on the items? I noticed how none of the items were priced in the way they are at most of the stores in New York. Jack laughed. Believe me, the only reason for that is that I simply haven't had the time to price each item. I keep a ledger behind the counter in which I can quickly look up a price if I don't know it offhand. But when you have time, you're welcome to start that gargantuan task. I'd love to, Jane said eagerly. She hadn't expected to enjoy working in the mercantile store as much as she did the day before. The work was soothing and pleasant. She enjoyed meeting some of the town folk and quickly picked up how fond everyone was of Jack. Here she wasn't judged in the way she had been in New York, first by society and then by her clients at the inn. All the locals she met were friendly to her, almost accepting because she was Jack's wife. It was a welcome change. A knock on the door had Jane and Jack turning to see a customer waiting outside the door. Goodness, I completely lost track of the time. Jack jumped up and quickly opened the door before flicking the sign from closed to open. Sorry about that, good morning. Morning, Jack. The man in uniform greeted him with a tip of his hat. If I had such a pretty lady to talk to, I'd lose track of time as well. Jack chuckled as he led the man to Jane. Jane, please meet Sheriff Jackson. Sheriff, this is my wife, Jane Morrow. The pleasure is all mine, miss. You mightn't have a sister, do ya? The sheriff asked with a wink of an eye, making Jane laugh before he turned to Jack. I'm in need of some coffee grounds, Jack. Man can't start a morning without it. Jane, eager to help, spoke up first. I'll fetch it for you, Sheriff. She walked towards the first aisle on the right and began to scour the shelves when she heard Jack clear his throat. She turned and saw Jack gesturing to the next aisle. Jane quickly moved towards the next aisle and returned to the counter with the coffee grounds. Helpful wife you've got there, Jack. The sheriff smiled as he accepted the coffee grounds. You'll add that to my tab? I will, Sheriff. Have a good day. Jack waved the sheriff goodbye. I'm sorry, I should have paid more attention yesterday. Jane quickly apologized for wasting the sheriff's time. Jane, don't apologize. It'll take time for you to know what we stock and where we keep it. Besides, it didn't seem as if the sheriff minded waiting. Jack hastened to reassure her. Now, let's start unpacking those boxes. Jane followed Jack to the boxes stacked near the rear of the store. Once she began unpacking boxes and stacking shelves, the time seemed to fly by. Every now and then, a customer would come in, and Jack would invite her over to introduce her. Jane appreciated his efforts to make her feel like an integral part of his life, and she appreciated the townfolk even more for their kindness in welcoming her. She made sure that her hair was perfect every time she walked up to the counter and that she wore a friendly smile. This was where she wanted to build her future, and she wanted to make sure that she made the best first impression with everyone she met. Jane especially wanted to demonstrate to Jack that she was capable not only of helping him, but that she was an asset to his store as well as his home. He had given her a second chance at happiness, and happiness is what she wanted to give him in return. She couldn't be sure if his feelings for her were as strong as the feelings she had for him, but she knew in her heart that after only a few days as Jack Morrow's wife, she wanted to spend the rest of her life loving him and living in Winter Creek. She could only hope he felt the same way. Chapter 11. Jack Morrow couldn't help but feel privileged to be living in the 19th century. He often found himself simply in awe of all the inventions that had been made over the span of the previous century. As a mercantile owner, he was often the first to learn of new products and the first to read about new inventions in the newspapers. As he began to open the latest delivery of boxes, he quickly tried to think of all the inventions and discoveries that had been made in the last few decades alone. There was the railway system that eased travel throughout the world. Then there was the telegram, which eased communication. He had even read an article a while back about a French inventor who had designed an airship. Jack shook his head at the thought of traveling by air. But today he wasn't excited about the railway system, steam locomotives, or even the music box he had learned a German inventor had created. Instead, he was excited about a new remedy that had just arrived by train the day before. The town doctor was just as curious about the new remedy Jack would stock in his store as Jack was. The remedy claimed to heal ailments such as heartburn, nausea, fatigue, and even headaches. A miracle remedy is what people called it. Jack opened the box and felt excitement course through his veins as he removed a single bottle. The glass bottle felt cool in his hand as he observed the dark liquid that was touted to be a remedy for all ails. Inside the box was a poster that Jack could put up in the store to advertise the new product. It was referenced as being an intellectual beverage and a cure for all nervous affections. It claimed to be appealing to every palate and an invigorating and refreshing beverage. Over the last year, Jack had read numerous newspaper articles about the invention of the chemist, J. Pemberton. But now, to finally hold the product in his hand made him grateful to be a mercantile owner. As a mercantile owner in a small town, he had the privilege of bringing this new miracle product to town. It even claimed to cure hysteria and melancholy. Instead of opening a bottle and tasting it for himself, Jack found himself wanting to share the moment with Jane. Over the last couple of weeks, he had come to admire his new wife, both for her working ethics and her kind demeanor. Jane was still a little shy and withdrawn when it came to the customers, but Jack felt as if he was making inroads when it came to their personal relationship. Although they worked together in the store every morning, Jack missed her in the afternoons when she left the store for home. He found himself wanting to spend more and more time with her with every passing day. He took the bottle and headed towards the front of the store where Jane was preparing to open for the day. He found her going through the customer ledgers, her brow furrowed as she scanned the pages. Jack had learned early on that Jane was curious by nature and that she wanted to learn as much about the business as she could. Trying to figure out the ledgers? Jack asked her curiously while hiding the bottle behind his back. Jane slammed the ledger shut as if she had been caught with her hand in the proverbial cookie jar. She quickly summoned a smile and laughed. "Jack, you gave me a fright." "Goodness, I can see that." Jack laughed. "You're welcome to look through those any time. It might help you to become more familiar with our customers and their usual purchases." Jane nodded. "I see the ledger isn't in alphabetical order. Doesn't that make it harder for you to find the entry you are looking for when the store is busy?" Jack nodded. "It does, but I simply haven't had the time to copy over the entire ledger in alphabetical order." "I can do that," Jane offered with a kind smile. "It would make things much easier." Jack smiled gratefully. "You truly are a godsend, just like the newspapers report this to be." He brandished the bottle from behind his back. "It arrived!" Jane's eyes widened with surprise. "Is that it? Coca-Cola?" "Yep, the miracle cure-all. Care to taste, Mrs. Morrow?" Jack asked with an excited smile. Jane laughed. "But we're not ill, Jack. Surely you're not supposed to drink a remedy for which you don't have an ailment." Jack shrugged as she opened the bottle. "It might be a plant-based remedy for numerous ailments, but it also claims to be a brain tonic. Don't you think we could do with a little tonic this close to Christmas?" "Definitely," Jane agreed. Jack offered her the first sip. He watched as she drank and waited eagerly for her feedback. "It's sweet, but not too sweet. It's refreshing," Jane mused, passing the bottle back to Jack. Jack took a sip and smiled in agreement. "It truly is refreshing. Instead of storing it on the shelf with the other remedies, I think we should display it on the counter. That way everyone will be able to see that it's arrived in Winter Creek. And it will probably sell out before Christmas." Jane nodded eagerly. "You've got a mind for business, Jane. It's a blessing to me to know that you do." Jane blushed lightly and shook her head. "Only because I'm learning from you." For a moment their eyes locked, and Jack felt hope bloom in his chest. When he'd invited Jane to Winter Creek, he had never for a moment thought that he would love her so deeply so quickly. He wanted so much more than just to be her companion. But seeing as they'd only met a few weeks ago, Jack knew that patience was the key. A knock on the door had them both startled. Jane's laughter was contagious as she turned to open the door. "It seems that brain tonic hasn't kicked in just yet." Jack smiled at her before he greeted their first customer of the day. Chapter 12. Jane had never imagined that so many people could fit into the mercantile store at once. Looking around the store, there were people everywhere. Some carried baskets to collect their own items off the rows of shelves, whereas others were queuing at the front, waiting for Jack to assist them. Jane quickly gave up on sweeping the floors and dusting the shelves, as she had planned to do that morning when they opened, knowing Jack needed all the help he could get. Over the last few weeks, she had become more acquainted with the location of the goods in the store, and now navigated her way through the store with ease when collecting items for the customers who brought Jack a list. After collecting candles, flour, ribbons, and boiled sweets, Jane headed back to the counter, where Jack and the customer were patiently waiting. "Here you go," Jane said. flustered by the number of people in the row. Jack smiled at her kindly. "Thank you." He turned back to the customer and finished the transaction before the next person in the queue stepped up to be helped. Jane quickly recognized her as the sheriff's wife to whom she'd been introduced the week before. "Good morrow, Jack. I hope you can help me. I want to get the sheriff a gift for Christmas. I couldn't think of anything until this morning." "Of course. What do you have in mind?" Jack asked patiently, clearly not deterred by the long queue of customers still waiting to be served. "I was thinking about a new hat. The one he has is stained and has seen better days. Molly over at the dress shop told me about the boss of the plains. Do you happen to have them in stock?" Jack smiled broadly, and Jane knew exactly why. Stetson hats were the very best hats available, and they brought in a sizable profit as well. "Of course I do." "Jane?" Jane nodded with a smile before she moved to the back of the store where they kept the hats and clothing. She reached up to retrieve a box, checking inside to make sure the hat was still in pristine condition before she headed back to the counter to present it to Jack and the sheriff's wife. While Jack concluded the transaction, Jane stood only a few steps away in case Jack needed her. "Mrs. Wallace, I almost didn't recognize you. You've changed your hair." Jack greeted the next person in line. Jane's eyes darted towards the older woman, and she felt the heat rise to her face. Her hands flew to her hair, making sure it was in place before she lowered her gaze to the ground. Jack was completely unaware of her reaction as he continued to talk to his customer. "Thank you for noticing, Jack. I thought a shorter style might take up less of my time," Mrs. Wallace replied. "How is Mr. Wallace? Has he recovered from the accident yet?" Jack inquired. Jane refused to look up, but she listened to every word that was said. "Not yet, no. That leg is still bad. He's as miserable as a horse without water and a bear with a sore tooth, but I can't blame him for it. Thought I might get him some of that new remedy I've been hearing about," Mrs. Wallace explained. "I'm not sure if it will help, but you're welcome to try." Jack reached for a bottle of Coca-Cola. "Anything else for you this morning?" Mrs. Wallace lifted a basket onto the counter. "Thought I'd save you the time. I gathered what I needed before I took my place in line." "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Wallace." Jack began to unpack the basket. "Where is that new wife of yours, Jack?" Mrs. Wallace asked in a teasing tone of voice. "She's become quite the talk of the town. Everyone is saying how pretty she is and kind. I'd love to meet her if she's around." Jane took a step back, trying to make a quiet escape without anyone noticing. 7%. She felt feverish and anxious. "Oh, you haven't met Jane yet?" Jack inquired. "You're going to like her. I'm sure of it. Everyone does." Before Jack could call her closer, Jane made her escape. She quickly walked through the storage room to exit through the back of the store into the courtyard. The cold air stung her cheeks, but Jane was grateful for the reprieve. She had never been more grateful for the enclosed courtyard than she was now. The privacy gave her a moment to compose herself, a moment to try and fight down all the feelings that were befuddling her mind. She leaned over with her hands on her knees and drew in a few deep breaths. Every time she exhaled, the puffs were cloudy in the frosty air. But Jane didn't even feel the cold. She was too overwhelmed. Jane calmed herself by thinking of Jack and the future she wanted for them. She reminded herself why she had come to Winter Creek and why she had left New York. She still wasn't ready to go back into the store. Although she knew Jack needed her help, she needed a little time on her own more. Chapter 13. "I'm sure I will," Mrs. Wallace agreed with Jack. Jack nodded as he scanned the store. "Jane, can you come here for a moment?" Jack craned his neck, trying to spot Jane. A frown creased his brow as he searched but failed to find her. "Jane?" "She ain't back here," someone called out from the rear of the store. "Don't see her, Jack," someone else called out. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wallace. I thought she was right here. She must have slipped out for a moment." Jack apologized, wondering where his wife had gone. Usually she would tell him if she needed to use the privy or if she headed home to fetch something. "It's no problem, Jack. I'll just meet her the next time. What do I owe you?" Mrs. Wallace asked. Jack gave her the total and offered to put it on her ledger, but she insisted on paying cash. The next customer stepped up to the counter and Jack went on to help him. With the never-ending line of customers, he had all but forgotten about Jane when he suddenly noticed her in the storage room in the back. "Excuse me," Jack said apologetically to the next person in line before making his way to Jane. As he walked into the storeroom, Jack was quick to notice that she looked feverish and rather ill. "Jane, what's wrong?" Jane shook her head with an apology in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Jack. I suddenly feel very unwell. I don't know what's going on with me." Jack touched her shoulder and searched her gaze. She truly didn't seem herself. "It's all right. No need to apologize. Why don't you head on home and rest for a while?" "I can't leave you. Just look at the store." "You'll be overrun," Jane argued, shaking her head. Jack gently squeezed her shoulder with affection. "I've been overrun before. I'll survive. Your health is more important to me than customers having to wait a little longer. Now, I won't hear any argument about it. Go on, rest a while." He could see the indecision in Jane's eyes, but she finally nodded. "Just for a short while." Jack returned to his place behind the counter, feeling more than a little concerned for his wife. She had seemed perfectly fine that morning when they opened the store. She had even been in high spirits. Whatever had overcome her had come on suddenly. "Any plans for Christmas, Jack?" the next customer in line asked. Jack smiled at the gentleman who had been frequenting the store from the very first day it opened. "Actually, I'm not sure. It will be my first Christmas as a married man. Not sure what the new wife and I will be doing." It sounded strange to hear himself talk about being a married man, but it felt right. He and Jane had been so busy with the store having its busiest time of year that they hadn't even discussed what they would be doing for Christmas. The day flew by in a blur of orders, customers, and ledger entries. By the time Jack closed the store, it was almost 7 o'clock at night. He found himself smiling as he glanced out over the thoroughfare. The town was quiet, for almost everyone had retreated to spend the evening with family and friends. Christmas decorations, wreaths, and ribbons decorated the stores, a reminder of the special evening that had finally arrived. As soon as he walked in through the back door, Jack's breath caught. Beside the fireplace stood a beautiful tree decorated with ribbons. The last time he had a Christmas tree in the house was before he had lost his parents. He spotted Jane on the floor cutting out more decorations. "Jane, how are you feeling?" Jack asked, moving towards her. "Fine, really. I don't know what came over me. I had a little rest and felt as fit as a fiddle. I snuck out," Jane said with a mischievous grin, "and asked the sheriff to help me to find a tree." Jack laughed. "He does adore you. I'm sure he appreciated you asking him for his help." "He did," Jane agreed. "I hope you don't mind, but I took some board and ribbons from the store yesterday to decorate the tree. I've written down what I took. I'll pay you for it." Jack shook his head. "There is no need. It's worth every dime." Jane smiled happily. "What do you think?" Jack looked at the tree and felt his heart swell with joy. "It's lovely, just as you are." Jane blushed and quickly stood up from the floor. "The table has been set if you're ready for dinner." "You did all this and cooked dinner as well?" Jack asked in surprise. Jane nodded. "It is Christmas Eve, after all. And since I left you by yourself in the store, it's only fair that you have a warm meal waiting when you get home." Jack found himself admiring her. She truly was a blessing he hadn't expected. While Jane plated their food, Jack collected his Bible from his room. His family hadn't had many Christmas traditions, but they did have one he wanted to share with Jane. Once they were seated at the table, he turned to Jane. "Our family was never one for extravagant traditions, but every Christmas Eve we would read from Luke to remind ourselves of the reason for the season." Jane smiled warmly. "That's a lovely tradition." Jack nodded, feeling as if he had a family for the first time since losing his parents. He hadn't realized how lonely he had been until now. Having Jane to share Christmas Eve with made his heart feel whole again. He opened the Bible and began to read. Jane sat quietly and listened as Jack read about Mary and Joseph finding shelter in a stable and how the Son of God was born. It was a moment he knew he would never forget. When he finished reading, he smiled at Jane with hope in his eyes. "May all our Christmases together be blessed with a tree, a warm meal, and a reading from the book of Luke." Jane reached for his hand, the first time she made any gesture of that kind. I think that's a wonderful wish on Christmas Eve. Chapter 14. Jane woke up on Christmas morning feeling exhausted and emotional. She had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as guilt invaded every corner of her mind. She rolled out of bed and moved to the window, but not even the sight of fresh snow on the ground could lift her spirits. Outside, she could see children bundled up while they built snowmen, the perfect start to a Christmas morning. Instead of feeling excited by the sacred holiday and what it would bring, Jane dreaded the very thought of getting dressed and facing her husband. When she had started on this journey, she had never thought the guilt would overcome her. She had thought it was the perfect solution to her problems and troubled past, but now she found herself wondering if she hadn't made things even worse by trying to fix them. A tear slipped over her cheek as flurries of snow drifted to the ground. A shiver ran down her spine, although the house was nice and toasty, thanks to the fire that Jack kept stoked all through the night. She wasn't sure if he did it for himself or because she was there, but she appreciated having a warm home after having spent so many nights shivering in her sleep. Even that small act of kindness made the guilt grow even bigger. When she arrived in Winter Creek to meet Jack, the guilt had been but a pebble in her shoe. Now it was a dark cloud hanging over her, one that weighed more than a train with its weight settled on her shoulders. A heavy sigh escaped her as she brushed the tear from her cheek. There was no one to whom she could turn, no one to whom she could confess. This was a burden she had created for herself, and one she had to carry alone. Jane, not knowing what else to do, moved to her bed and kneeled before it. She clasped her hands together and closed her eyes, hoping that at least the Lord would be able to ease her heavy heart. Lord God Almighty, I kneel before you this morning, begging for you to help me to find a way out of this madness I have created. I thought I was doing the right thing, following the right path, but I now find myself wondering if I have ever followed the right path. It's as if I take one wrong turn after the other, and the last turn I took was the worst of all. I don't want to hurt Jack, Lord. I've come to feel very deeply for him, but how can I live this lie? How can I give him my heart if he doesn't know all there is to know about me? How much longer can I guard this secret, hoping it doesn't ruin me? I beg you to forgive me all my trespasses, Lord. I beg of you to understand why I did what I did. I beg of you to help me find a way to live without the guilt, without the weight, and without the shame. Please, God, help me. Amen. Jane rose to her feet and let out a sigh, wondering if the Lord was truly as wonderful as the Bible promised. Would he be able to forgive her for what she had done? And worst of all, for now dragging Jack into her troubles as well? She had never meant to hurt Jack, but she had never planned on falling in love with him either. She drew in a deep breath before she changed into her best dress. This morning, they would attend the Christmas service at church, and although Jane felt anxious about the public appearance, she wanted to make sure she looked her best for Jack. She felt all the more guilty this morning as soon as she stepped out of her bedroom and saw Jack standing in the kitchen. He looked tired, and she knew it was her fault. The day before had been his busiest day, and she had left him in the lurch, simply because she couldn't face up to her past. Her heart skipped a beat, hoping he couldn't read her mind as she moved towards him. "Merry Christmas, Jack." Jack's expression lifted at the sight of her. A smile curved his handsome mouth as he met her gaze. "Merry Christmas, Jane. I thought I'd cook us breakfast before the service. Some biscuits and ham, perhaps?" Jane offered while moving into the kitchen. Jack shook his head as he reached for her hand. "That won't be necessary. There is something else we need to attend to before we go to the service." Jane frowned, confused. "And what would that be?" "We need to see if Santa Claus left something under the tree." Jack teased her, nodding towards the tree. Jane's eyes widened with surprise when she noticed a small box beneath the Christmas tree she had decorated the day before. "Jack, you shouldn't have. I didn't get you anything." Jack shrugged innocently. "Neither did I. That's all Santa. I hear he came through town a little after midnight." Jane laughed as she walked towards the tree. "Did he now?" Definitely. I even heard the sleigh when it landed on the main street. Jane shook her head as she retrieved the gift. She hadn't experienced this playful side of Jack before and found it more charming than even his smile. It made her feel all the more guilty. Go on. Open it, Jack encouraged her, moving to her side. Jane carefully untied the ribbon before she opened the box. Her breath caught at the sight of the gift inside. Jack, it arrived just on time. I was afraid it would only get here after the new year, but it arrived yesterday morning, Jack said, pleased as he looked at the item in the box. It must have cost a fortune, Jane breathed as she allowed her fingers to brush over the engraved silver oval. To see the look on your face now makes it all worthwhile. Go on, put it on. It was the most beautiful item of jewelry that Jane had ever laid eyes on. The locket was of pure silver and hung on a beautiful silver chain. With Jack's help, she slipped it over her head and reached for the clasp on the locket. The locket opened, making Jane smile even more. On the one side was a watch, and on the other a space in which to slip a small photo. A tear escaped her eyes as she met Jack's gaze. I don't have any photos? Then we'll have to have one taken of us. When the fair comes through town in summer, there is usually a photographer amongst the showmen, Jack promised her with a smile. Jane shook her head as she searched his gaze. What did I do to deserve you? You were honest in your letters. It was your honesty about your past that made me write to you. Jack's voice held warmth and admiration. Jane felt as if she was even more unsightly than a dead slug. She might have been honest, but she hadn't told him everything. Another tear joined the first as the guilt washed over her. There, don't cry now. You don't want puffy eyes for the service, do you? Jack offered her his handkerchief. Jane sniffed, trying to get her emotions under control. Jack was right. She needed to be at her best when they attended the service. She needed to have all her wits about her. Chapter 15. It seemed as if the entire population of Winter Creek had come out to attend the Christmas service at the chapel that morning. The bells rang overhead as more and more people arrived. Jack smiled as he approached the chapel with Jane by his side. She looked more beautiful this morning than ever before. Her pale skin was like porcelain in the cool morning light, and her dark auburn hair glistened with health. He had become used to Jane's habit of frequently fiddling with her hair to make sure it was in place, although, to him, it always looked just right. He smiled at her, wishing he could have been holding her hand instead of just offering her his elbow. Patience, he reminded himself. For a moment, he found himself thinking back to Christmas the year before. It had been the loneliest day of his life. It had been his first Christmas without his parents, and a terrible reminder of what his life would be like unless he found someone to share it with. Jack realized now that last Christmas was the time he had started to think about finding himself a mail-order bride. And now, a year later, here he was, with his wife by his side. As they approached the church, they were welcomed eagerly by the townsfolk who were already congregating outside. Christmas greetings and well wishes were exchanged, even as mothers tried to keep their children out of the snow while they waited for the service to begin. Jack spotted Mr. and Mrs. Wallace and turned to Jane. Come, there are Mr. and Mrs. Wallace. I wanted to introduce you yesterday. Jane quickly glanced toward the Wallaces before she shook her head. Later, I think we should head inside. I just saw the pastor go in. Jack nodded in agreement as the other members of the congregation began to make their way into the church. The service began with a prayer of thanks before they praised the Lord with Christmas carols. The children were invited to the front to lead the congregation in the last carol of the morning. Jane sat quietly beside Jack, and although her eyes were on the pastor, Jack couldn't help but feel as if she was a little distracted. The pastor took his place at the front, and Jack directed his attention there. Brothers and sisters, I welcome you this morning to celebrate with me the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. We will be reading from the book of Luke this morning, Luke 2:10. Behold, I bring you tidings of great joy. Jack caught movement from the corner of his eye and noticed that Jane was looking at the Wallaces. As soon as she noticed him looking, she quickly turned her attention back to the pastor. The pastor preached about how Christmas Day was to be celebrated and how the Lord had sent his only Son to roam the earth so that our sins could be forgiven. It was a very moving service, one befitting the special day. A few times throughout the course of the sermon, he noticed Jane casting her eyes in the direction of the Wallaces. Jack found it a little curious, but didn't think much of it. Jane was new in town, and it was only natural to be curious about the people she hadn't met. Another thing I want to bring to your attention on this holiest of days is gratitude. Turn to your left and look at the person sitting beside you. Now turn to your right and look at the person sitting beside you. Look all around and be grateful today for the people in your life. Be grateful for your family, your friends, and the community which you call home. To be loved is to be blessed. To be appreciated is to be blessed. Appreciate and love one another today. Be grateful for all the blessings in your life, and be grateful to God for allowing you such a blessing. Jack smiled at Jane, and without thinking, found himself reaching for her hand. He closed his hand over hers and expected her to abruptly pull away, but instead, she closed her fingers over his hand as she smiled at him. His heart overflowed with joy and love in that moment. They held hands for the rest of the sermon, and although neither said a word, Jack felt as if a bridge had been crossed, as if they had taken the first step to acknowledging their feelings for each other. By the time the service was over, Jack had a renewed hope for the future. He was still holding Jane's hand when they walked out of the church. The sheriff and his wife came over. "Merry Christmas, Jack, Jane. I'm sure you're incredibly grateful to be spending your first Christmas together," his wife said with a smile. Jack nodded. "More than grateful. I see you've been blessed with a new Stetson, Sheriff." The sheriff chuckled. "I have. It's not a new wife, but it'll do." Everyone laughed at the sheriff's joke before he turned to Jane. "And how did the tree come along, Jane?" "It looks lovely now that it's trimmed." "Thank you again for your help, Sheriff," Jane replied with a smile as she touched her hair. "Well, you two must have a wonderful Christmas," the sheriff said before he led his wife away. Jack turned to Jane and saw her glancing at the Wallaces again. "Come, let me introduce you." Jane quickly shook her head and suddenly withdrew her hand from his. "Perhaps another day. There is a lot to prepare for Christmas dinner. I can't have my new husband sit down to an ordinary meal on Christmas Day." Jack laughed. "Does that mean it's going to be an extraordinary meal?" Jane smiled with a hopeful look. "That is the plan." Jack offered her his elbow, wondering if she was a little shy about holding his hand in public. "Very well then, Mrs. Morrow. Let's go and prepare an extraordinary meal." Jane's laughter was sweet as she slipped her hand through his elbow. "Let's." As they walked home, Jack savored every second. He knew that he would remember his first Christmas with Jane for as long as he lived. Chapter 16. When they arrived home, Jane put on a fresh pot of coffee. While it brewed, she gathered everything she needed to prepare their Christmas meal. She had planned ahead, but now she needed to bring together everything she had in mind. "You seem a little distracted this morning, Jane. You really don't have to cook up a feast. It's only the two of us," Jack said, picking up on her anxiety. Jane shook her head and offered him a cup of coffee. "I want to. I just have a lot on my mind, like how I want to roast the beef and the potato pie I want to make. The sheriff's wife gave me a recipe the other day, and although I've never made it before, I'm sure it's going to taste delicious." "It sounds delicious. How can I help?" Jack offered. Jane shook her head. "You can relax by the fire. You had a long day yesterday. You don't need to do anything today except to keep the fire going in the fireplace." "Good idea," Jack said with a grin. "I think the temperature is going to drop even more come evening." While Jack headed into the courtyard to collect more wood for the fireplace, Jane began to cook. She had hoped that cooking would take her mind off her rambling thoughts, but instead, she found herself jailed by them. She had believed that the Christmas service at church would help to ease her guilt, or at least calm her anxious nerves, but the service only made her feel worse. How could she be grateful for what she had when she wasn't even sure she deserved it? Jack deserved so much better than her. He deserved complete honesty. Jane glanced at him beside the fireplace. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady. He was in a slumber, which made her feel even worse. He was overworked, and she couldn't run from the store for the rest of her life whenever she felt a little overwhelmed. When he reached for her hand during the service, Jane had thought for a moment that nothing else mattered. But the moment the sheriff's wife reminded them to be grateful for finding each other, the guilt had overwhelmed her once more. How many prayers would it take before the guilt would finally abate? Emotion burned her eyes as she slipped the roast into the oven. The potatoes were boiling on the stove, according to the recipe she was following. Left to her own thoughts, Jane found herself feeling like a traitor. She had deceived Jack, and in that moment, Jane realized she would never stop feeling this way unless she told him the truth. All of it. She drew in a deep breath before she took off her apron. Gathering all her courage, she moved to the fireplace where Jack was dozing. She cleared her throat, feeling horrible for waking him. But she needed to do this now before her courage failed her again. "Jack?" Jane asked quietly. Jack murmured something before his eyes slowly drifted open. "Is it dinner time yet?" "No," Jane shook her head. "But it is time that I tell you something." Jack blinked a few times, a little dazed from sleep. "What is it?" Jane drew in a deep breath. "I'm not who you think I am. I haven't been completely honest with you." "Jane, what are you talking about?" Jack asked, sitting upright. Jane reached for her hair, but instead of fixing it, as she always did, she drew off the wig completely. Her light golden hair spilled over her shoulders, even as a tear slipped over her cheek. Jack's eyes widened with surprise, even as his jaw dropped in shock. The fact that he was rendered speechless was clear by the way he looked at her with confusion muddling his eyes. "I had to wear the wig. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I'm telling you now." Jack let out a baffled sigh. "All right, so you didn't tell me you had gold hair. Now I know. I think I can deal with that." He tilted his head slightly and searched her gaze. "Actually, it suits you much better." Jane let out an impatient huff. "My hair isn't the secret, Jack." Jack frowned. "There's more?" Jane nodded. "There's more, much, much more." Chapter 17. Jane took a seat, her hair fanned out over her shoulders. She had never thought she'd be telling Jack this tale, but she knew it was time. She clasped her hands on her lap and turned her gaze to the fire. Perhaps if she was focused on the flames, it would be easier to admit all her mistakes. Perhaps then it would be easier to confess them to Jack. She hadn't expected to fall in love with Jack, but now that she had, she knew she couldn't build a future with him on lies. I was 17 when the rail workers came to town. It was magnificent to see how every day another piece of railway was laid. Having grown up in a small town, the only people I'd ever known were the people in town. I'd never met anyone from another country or someone who spoke another language. My friends and I would watch the rail workers from a distance, fascinated by their languages and their appearances. It was as if a whole new world had come to our town, one that intrigued me. Of course, my parents warned me against talking to the rail workers. My father called them ill-mannered brutes. My mother called them savages. But of course, a young, curious girl didn't believe her parents. Instead, my friends and I would go to the railway every afternoon to watch them work. Then one afternoon, it was in the middle of summer, a couple of them suddenly walked towards us. My friend, believing that they were indeed savages, jumped up and ran for her life. But I think curiosity stopped me from running away. "Did they hurt you?" Jack asked with a frown in a low voice. Jane quickly shook her head. "No, not at all." She closed her eyes and allowed herself to be taken back to that fateful day that had changed her life forever. Tommy introduced himself to me and introduced me to his friend. His friend barely said hello before he returned to the line to work. Tommy sat with me. First, we just talked about the railway, but soon our conversation turned to more personal topics. Tommy told me how he was an orphan who had grown up in an orphanage in Boston. He told me how becoming a railway worker had given him freedom and the privilege of seeing most of the country. He was kind and very charming and knew just what to say to capture my young heart. Jane sighed as she watched the flames dance in the fireplace. For weeks, I went out to the railway to see Tommy. Most days we would sit and talk, but sometimes we would have a picnic or he'd come into town with me. He was different, you know? He was free and answered to no one. He had this exciting life while I'd been stuck in the same town my whole life with no prospect of ever leaving. Then my parents saw us together. That night, when I arrived home, they were waiting for me. My father was furious, and my mother, nothing had ever hurt me more than the disappointment I saw in her eyes. They scolded me for being seen with a railway worker. My father said that my involvement with Tommy could cost him his good family name, whereas my mother warned me that it would tarnish my reputation for the rest of my life. Only soiled doves keep company with railway workers. That's what my mother said. But Tommy, he wasn't like the other railway workers. He was different. He was nice and friendly, and he really liked me. I tried to explain that to my parents, but they wouldn't listen. My father warned me to stay away and promised he would make sure that Tommy never spoke to me again. Jane felt a tear slip over her cheek at the memory. She wasn't sure if Jack was still listening, but she knew if she stopped now, she would never finish. My father did just that. The following day, when I went to see Tommy, he ignored me. He wouldn't even look at me. I thought he might need a little time to cool off after my father had a word with him, but I was wrong. I was never anything more to Tommy than a distraction, a way to while away his time. Only 2 days later, I saw him in town with 2 of the soiled doves from the saloon. He was laughing and they were all over him. It was clear. Jane paused to find the appropriate words. It was clear that they were much more than friends, that they'd been intimate. "Jane, I'm so sorry you had to see that," Jack said quietly from his seat. Jane shook her head, not wanting his sympathy. Not just yet. I don't know if I was angrier at myself for falling for Tommy or angrier that my parents had been right. That evening, my parents had the privilege of saying, "I told you so." It only made me angrier. Because I'd been spending so much time at the railway, I knew exactly what time the different trains came through. I packed my bag in the middle of the night and jumped on a freight train headed for New York. I was tired of being a hostage in my own life. I wanted to see more and experience more, and I didn't want my parents there reminding me every time I made a mistake. "You ran away?" Jack asked gently. Jane nodded, without even saying goodbye. Chapter 18. Jack searched Jane's eyes and felt his heart go out to her. He couldn't imagine how hard it must have been for a girl of 17 to travel to New York on her own. Of course, he felt betrayed by her lies, but he would think about that later. Right now, he needed to learn more about all she hadn't told him. "What happened when you arrived in New York, Jane?" Jack scoffed and shook his head. "Is that even your real name?" Jane quickly turned and met his gaze. "Yes, it is my real name. Everything else about me is real, except—" Jane struggled to control the tears. "Let me finish. I'm afraid if I don't, I never will." Jack nodded for her to continue. "I arrived in New York hungrier and dirtier than I'd ever been before. I had never felt more afraid and more desperate in my entire life. I was begging on a street corner that very afternoon when a kind lady from the inn across the road offered me a job making beds and washing dishes. She cleaned me up and put me to work after giving me a good meal. I worked at the inn for months, living in one of the storage rooms before she finally allowed me to become a server. The wages were paltry, my room even worse, but at least I wasn't going hungry. It was going into winter then, and I was simply grateful that I didn't have to sleep out in the cold. You see, I blamed myself for leaving home in anger, for losing touch with my parents, and for not listening to them as I should have. I thought I was wiser, old enough to make my own decisions, but I was too proud to write to them and admit otherwise. I came to recognize the frequent customers at the inn, those who simply came to dine and those who only spent the night before they would move on with their journey. But one day, on my 18th birthday, a man I had never seen before walked into the inn. His name was Daniel Howard. Even from a distance, you could see he was wealthy. The way he wore his hat, the way his suit was cut, even the shoes he wore. He was quite a few years older than me, but he was very charming. You have to know that it was his charm that got my attention. When he asked me out to dinner, I felt flattered. Why would a handsome and wealthy man like Daniel Howard be interested in a server girl at an inn? I fell for Daniel so quickly that I soon forgot about my past and leaving my parents. Suddenly, I was wealthy, had more security and stability than ever before, and I was dining with the elite members of society. I could finally justify all my mistakes because I was living such a wonderful life. But then, suddenly it wasn't so wonderful anymore. Daniel had started to change. The last year of our marriage was worse than any nightmare you could imagine. I was terrified of him and I hated him. I know it's wrong to say that, but I did. I was grateful when he passed away, Jane admitted quietly. Jack nodded. Although he couldn't understand it all, he could understand how Daniel's death had come as a relief to Jane. He had learned all about her marriage to Daniel in their letters to each other. Is that what you've been hiding from me? That you had a troubled past? That you were orphaned without having a chance to say goodbye to your parents? Jack watched Jane's features as she turned to look at him. It was clear that she hadn't told him everything just yet. He couldn't help but feel anxious about what she still needed to tell him. His feelings for her hadn't been changed by her revelations, but he knew that to be able to regain his trust, he needed her to tell him the truth about everything. Jane, what aren't you telling me? Jane drew in a deep breath before her gaze traveled to the fire again. I'm not an orphan. I wasn't sure, but I now know my parents are still alive. Jack frowned, confused. Jane turned to him with an emotional look. You see, Jack, the town I ran from, the town I wanted so badly to escape, it was Winter Creek, Jack gasped. Here? You grew up in Winter Creek? Yes, Jane nodded. Ever since that first day in New York, I wanted nothing more than to come back. But I never had the money, and then when I married Daniel, I couldn't just leave. Besides, he never let me handle any money. He had accounts at all the stores I frequented. He kept telling me it was a nuisance to carry money around. I believed him. So that's all I was to you? Jack demanded, standing up. Anger coursed through his veins. A train ticket back to your hometown? No. Jane stood up and walked towards him. Before Jack could move away, she grabbed his hands and searched his face with a pleading look. You have to believe me, Jack. Please just let me explain. Jack wanted nothing more than to walk away from the betrayal that hurt more than losing his parents, but he couldn't. Something in Jane's eyes made him stay to listen to what she had to say. Yes, I'll admit I was searching for a husband from Winter Creek. I was hoping to let him pay for my train fare home and then explain when I arrived. I even planned on paying him back every penny for his trouble once I was reunited with my parents. But I never, ever expected you. I didn't expect that I'd fall in love with you through your letters. I didn't expect that I would want the future you dreamed of. I never thought I wanted to be the wife of a mercantile. I never expected any of that. When I arrived in town, I was certain that I would have the courage to tell you the truth. That was why I was wearing a wig. I wanted to tell you the truth before I went to see my parents. I didn't want them to see me before I was ready to see them. But then I saw you. I knew I couldn't walk away from you, from what we had. I knew from the first moment I laid eyes on you that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. I didn't tell you the truth because I didn't want to lose you. I couldn't lose you. You were the first person who truly understood me, the first person who made me feel appreciated and cared for. I couldn't walk away from that, Jack, and then you brought me here. Every day I spent with you in your home, at the store, I felt even deeper in love with you. I know you were only looking for a companion, but I found myself dreaming of truly being your wife. My feelings for you were unexpected. I didn't know how to confront my parents without losing you. I don't want to lose you, Jack. Not ever. Jack frowned and drew his hand through his hair. I don't know what to say. You planned on using me, but instead, you fell in love with me? Where does that leave us? Jane searched his gaze. That is up to you. I can't go on living a lie. If you'd like me to leave, I'll go right now. But if you feel anything for me, anything at all, then please give us another chance. This time, without any secrets at all. Jack shook his head. How could he turn her away when he'd fallen so deeply in love with her? She had made mistakes, sure, but she had also told him the truth now. He remembered the sermon from that morning and found himself reaching for forgiveness instead of anger. But he wasn't ready to forgive just yet. There was one more thing he needed to know first. Jane, who are your real parents? Jane took a deep breath before she met his gaze. Mr. and Mrs. Wallace. Chapter 19. Jane waited for Jack's reaction. For a few seconds, his face seemed frozen and devoid of any emotion. Her heart was racing a mile a minute as she waited for him to respond. Jack? Jane asked carefully. Jack frowned and tilted his head. That's why you were feeling ill in the store? That's why you kept looking at them in church? And that's why you didn't want to meet them after church? Jane nodded. Even with the wig. I was afraid my mother would recognize me. It's been years, but I knew she would recognize me. Jack chuckled. That's why you're always tugging at your hair. I thought you had a nervous habit of touching your hair. Now I know it was to keep the wig in place. Jane let out a wry laugh. Now you know that too. Silence hung in the air while Jane waited for Jack to decide what would happen next. She couldn't blame him if he asked her to leave and never to contact him again. But she hoped that wasn't the choice he was going to make. The roast, Jane cried out, realizing smoke was drifting from the kitchen. She ran to the wood stove and ripped the door open, allowing all the more smoke to billow from it. No, I ruined it. Using the oven mitt, she quickly pulled the roast out of the oven. Disappointment washed over her at the piece of charcoal that was the meat lying in the roasting pan. It was completely ruined. Feeling like an even bigger failure than she had before, the tears she had been trying to hold back finally broke free. Her shoulders shook as tears streamed over her cheeks. Not only had she ruined her own life, she had ruined Jack's life too. She had ruined Christmas, and now she had ruined the beef roast. It didn't matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to stop the tears. It was as if years of emotions were suddenly being poured out of her, and she had no control. She stiffened when she felt Jack's hands on her shoulders, certain that he was going to physically throw her out. That burning the roast beef had been the final straw on the camel's back. But instead of scooping her up and tossing her out into the snow, his touch gentled as he turned her around. He stepped forward and embraced her, allowing her to weep against his chest. Jane wasn't sure how long she stood there, crying her heart out, soaking Jack's shirt. But when she did finally feel the tears subside, she realized how wonderful it felt to be held by Jack. For a moment longer, she remained with her head against his chest, simply savoring how safe and cherished she felt. Jack was the one who finally took a step back. Instead of the anger she expected to see in his eyes, there was only kindness. He framed her face and searched her eyes before he spoke. I have a secret to tell you, too. Jane frowned. You do? Jack nodded. I lied. I don't just want a companion. I want a real wife, a real marriage, and I want us to have a real family. I love you, Jane. Just like you, I didn't expect to find love in the matrimonial times. But now that I have, I'm not going to let anything take it from me. But Jane tried to remind him of everything she had done, but he pressed a finger over her lips. You made mistakes. We all make mistakes. Yours might have been a little bigger, and you might have lied about them, but you have told me now. I can't imagine what your life must have been like in New York, but I am only glad that we found each other. Why don't we simply start over now that the truth is out in the open? How? Jane asked, sniffing. Jack took a step back and held out his hand. I am Jack Morrow. I'd like to be your husband in every sense of the word. I want to love you until my last breath, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Prosody. Jane laughed, feeling more than a little giddy at Jack's words. She rested her hand on his and met his gaze with a smile. I am Jane Morrow. I would like to be your wife in every sense of the word. I promise to always be honest with you, to never withhold anything from you ever again, and to love you for the rest of my life. Jack held her gaze for a moment before he stepped forward. He framed her face with the most tender touch before he brushed his lips over hers. Jane's tummy tilted even as her entire world shifted. When she opened her eyes, it felt as if all was right in the world. Jack still loved her, regardless of her deceit. I love you, Jack. And I love you, Jane. Jack smiled at her warmly, but I don't love you enough to try and eat that roast for Christmas dinner." Their laughter mingled in the kitchen as they assessed the burnt meat. Jack reached out and touched a strand of Jane's hair. "Your hair is beautiful. It looks like spun gold in the afternoon light." Jane smiled at the compliment. "I had better get started on dinner again." Jack shook his head. "No, there is somewhere we need to be first." "Where?" Jane asked with a frown. "We need to see your parents." "No, Jack, not today. Please, I can't bear to see their disappointment and anger. Can't we just celebrate Christmas?" Jane pleaded. Jack shook his head. "Christmas is a day for miracles and for family. I'll be right there with you the entire time, but they too deserve to know that they didn't lose a daughter. They need to know that you're still alive and that you're right here in town." Jane searched his eyes and was about to beg for a reprieve when she realized that Jack was right. As much as she had been wondering about her parents all these years, they must have worried about her. She couldn't give them back the time they had lost as a family, but she could give them the peace of mind of knowing that she was alive and well. "All right, are you ready to meet your in-laws?" Jane asked with half a smile. Jack nodded. "Readier than I'll ever be." Chapter 20. Peter and Ruth Wallace hadn't celebrated Christmas in true form in 6 years. Ever since their only child disappeared, it was as if the joy had been stolen from their life. They hardly spoke about Jane at all anymore, because talking about her only made it harder for them to accept that they would never see her again. When she'd first disappeared, both Peter and Ruth had thought she would return a day or two later with an apology or an argument. But Jane never returned. They had asked the sheriff to file a report for a missing person, but the sheriff had made it clear at the time that finding a missing person in the West was akin to finding water in a desert. Over those first few months, they had held hope in their hearts, thinking that every day would be the day their daughter returned home. But she never did. On the day of Jane's 18th birthday, Peter and Ruth had allowed themselves to mourn. They had to accept they would never see their daughter again. Either she had run off with a railway worker, run away on her own, or she had passed away. Today was their 6th Christmas without Jane, and just as they had done that very first year, they now wrote a letter to put under the tree. Tomorrow, the letter would be stored with the other 5, but for today, they would imagine Jane reading their words. Peter had his turn first and wrote almost an entire page. He told Jane about the injury to his leg and how much he missed her. He told her about how he wished he could see her face one more time and how he wished he could turn back time to before their last argument. When it was Ruth's turn, she was a little more emotional. She closed her eyes as she held the pen and thought about everything she would have said to Jane if she had been here today. Everything she would have told her if she could only see her one more time. "My dearest darling Jane, it doesn't feel like Christmas without you here. We don't feel blessed not knowing where you are, and we don't feel joyous because we could never apologize for the last argument we had. I want you to know that being a parent isn't easy. Doing the right thing, saying the right thing, it's almost harder than doing nothing at all. We wanted to protect you, we wanted what was best for you, but instead, we drove you away. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of you. I miss you, my darling daughter, wherever you might be in the world. I will always love you." Ruth was about to tell Jane about everything that had happened in Winter Creek that year when there was an unexpected knock at the door. "Who might that be?" Peter asked from his chair. "I'll go see. You keep that leg still," Ruth warned her husband as she moved towards the door. She would finish her letter to Jane later, she promised herself before she opened the door. "Jack, this is a surprise," Ruth said, summoning a smile. She wasn't in the mood for guests, but she wasn't about to be rude. She glanced briefly at the woman by Jack's side and smiled. "I see you brought your wife. Finally, we get to meet her." "Come in." Ruth opened the door wider and moved towards the table. She quickly put away the letter she had been writing before turning to her guests. "Peter, Jack came to introduce us to his wife." Ruth smiled at her husband as Jack and his wife stood just inside the door. "Actually, Mrs. Wallace," Jack began in a hesitant tone. Before Jack could finish, his wife spoke for the very first time. "Mama, Pa?" Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She quickly muffled it with a chuckle and shook her head. She had been thinking of Jane and didn't even hear a word Jack's wife had said. "I'm sorry, darling, I didn't get your name." Jack's wife stepped forward, and a flicker of recognition rushed through Ruth's system. "Mama, it's me, Jane." All the blood rushed to Ruth's head, causing her to feel a little unsteady. She blinked twice, and when her eyes focused again, she knew it wasn't her mind playing tricks on her. Right before her very eyes stood the daughter she hadn't seen in years, the daughter she had been writing to only a few moments ago. "Jane." "It's me, Ma," Jane said, her voice catching. Ruth gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth in shock. She turned to her husband and shook her head as her hands dropped to her sides. "Peter, it's Jane." "Took you a moment," her husband chuckled. "I recognized her the moment she stepped through the door. It's in the eyes." Peter got up and moved towards Jane with the help of a walking stick. "I knew you'd come back, Butterfly." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "Pa, I'm so sorry. I should have never left. You were right. You were right about everything." Ruth watched as her husband embraced their daughter. Tears freely streamed down her cheeks as she watched the reunion. She turned to Jack with a curious look, struggling to understand how he had come to marry her daughter. Jack smiled at her. "I'm sure she'll explain everything." Ruth nodded before she moved towards Peter and Jane. She joined the embrace, and her heart felt whole for the first time in 6 years. When they finally broke apart, Ruth's maternal instincts kicked in like never before. "You must be starving. It's almost dinner time. Goodness, I don't even have a roast in the oven, and it's Christmas." Jane laughed, shaking her head. "Mama, I didn't come home because I'm hungry." "Either way, you're as thin as a stick." Ruth turned to her new son-in-law and brushed away her tears. "Might I bother you to open the mercantile so we might buy a ham or a roast? I don't believe I have anything at all in the icebox." Jack laughed. "I'll go and fetch you one myself for my account." For Ruth and Peter, the day ended a whole lot differently than it had started. They spent the afternoon learning about the years their daughter had spent in New York before they listened to the fairy tale ending of how she had fallen in love with Jack. By the time they sat down for Christmas dinner, Ruth had more to be grateful for than she had ever imagined. Not only was her daughter back in Winter Creek, but she was happily married to a man both Peter and Ruth would have chosen for her themselves. Peter sat at the head of the table and waited for everyone to bow their heads before he said grace. When he spoke, it was with the strength and passion of a father once more, and no longer the emptiness of a father who had lost his daughter. Chapter 21. "Did your mother teach you to cook?" Jack asked later that night during their walk home from the Wallaces. Jane shrugged and smiled at her husband in the moonlight. "A little, but most of what I know I learned from Daniel's cook. I was very lonely during the time we were married. I used to spend a lot of time in the kitchen simply for the company. I soon learned that I enjoyed cooking as well." "Well, might I suggest you get the recipe for that roast from your ma? I've never tasted anything as good in my entire life," Jack admitted. "It's a good thing my ma didn't hear me saying that," Jane chuckled. "I would have liked to meet your parents." "They would have liked you. Well, my parents simply adore you," Jane laughed. "I still can't believe what an eventful day it's been." "It's been quite eventful, I'll tell you that. I don't think I'll ever forget this Christmas." "I'm sorry if I ruined it for you." Jane stopped and waited for Jack to turn and look her in the eyes. "Ruined it for me? You made it better," Jack said, shaking his head as he took both her hands in his. "This morning I woke up, trying to find a way to tell you how I felt about you. I was blissfully unaware that I knew both my in-laws and that my wife actually had golden hair. I'd say good surprises all around." Jane felt her heart swell with love for the wonderful man she called her husband. Anyone else might have been furious over everything that had been revealed today, but not Jack. Instead, he saw them as good surprises. "There's one problem, though, a rather big one, I'd say," Jack said with a concerned look in his eyes. "I'm not sure what we're going to do about it, actually." "What's that?" Jane asked, confused. "Your hair," Jack said, shaking his head. "How to explain why you have worn a wig since you stepped off the train?" Laughter bubbled from Jane's throat. After everything that happened today, the last thing she imagined Jack would be concerned about was the color of her hair. I could just continue wearing the wig. Jack's eyes widened. Please don't. I could for the life of me not understand why you kept tugging at your hair all the time. Now that I know, it will bother me to no end. You could sell them? Jane suggested. Jack frowned. Sell your wig? No, silly, Jane chuckled. You could sell wigs at the mercantile. Then we can simply say that I was testing the comfort of the wigs before you decided to stock them. That way, it comes across as if we stock only products that are tried and tested. It will make your customers trust you even more. Jack's eyes widened even as a smile curved his mouth. That is a brilliant idea. We can put yours on display. Exactly. Jane nodded in agreement. They turned onto the thoroughfare and kept walking hand in hand. Soft music was floating out of the saloon, but other than that, every building was as quiet as a mouse. Jane stopped, turned her head up to the sky, and drew in a deep breath. How could I have ever wanted to leave this place? It's magical. It's home. Jack smiled at her. It is, especially now that you're here. Jane smiled as Jack pulled her into his arms. This time, when he kissed her, it was wonderful. Never would she doubt his feelings for her ever again. This was where she belonged. Right here, in Winter Creek, the very place she had fled from all those years ago. Epilogue. Epilogue. Peter, can you please stoke the coals before we all freeze to death? Ruth called out from the kitchen. We won't freeze to death if you manage to feed us first, Peter called back. Your leg is no longer an excuse, old man. Get moving, Ruth called back. Jane couldn't help but laugh at her parents. As a child, she had hated their playful banter, but now as an adult and a wife, she appreciated it. She knew it was their way of affectionately teasing each other. She turned to Jack and noticed his eyes darting back and forth between her mother and her father, seemingly confused. Don't worry, they're just teasing, Jane explained to him for about the millionth time. I'll get used to it eventually, Jack said, easing back into his chair. The service was beautiful this morning, wasn't it? It was. The pastor truly captured the meaning of Christmas in his sermon. And the children's choir, I'm so glad we have a school teacher eager enough to try new things. Our town has truly been blessed this last year, Jane expressed with a smile. So have we, Jack said, reaching for her hand. We have, Jane agreed. I can't believe a whole year has passed. Jack sighed almost to himself. For a moment, Jane was transported to Christmas Day the year before. She had truly thought that once she had revealed her past to Jack, it would result in him wanting to annul their marriage. But instead of turning his back on her, he had embraced who she truly was. Jane still thanked the Lord every single day for sending Jack to her. Together, they had not only grown in their relationship over the last year, but they had expanded the store as well. With new products available every month, Jack made a point of offering his clients the latest and the greatest in every department. Then, of course, there was the expansion of the house. Jane had insisted it wasn't necessary, but Jack had insisted it was. They now had a larger living area and an extra room in their home. They both dreamed of filling the house with children. Over and above considering how blessed she and Jack had been over the last year, Jane only had to glance at her mother in the kitchen of her childhood home to feel gratitude wash over her. A week after they reunited, she and her parents had discussed what had happened before Jane ran away. Jane had admitted to her mistakes, and her parents had explained that they were only trying to protect her. They had since made up for the lost time of the last 6 years, and Jane made a point of having dinner with her parents at least once a week. Her father's leg never completely healed. He still walked with a walking stick and a limp, but no one seemed to care. He was still there, still teasing her mother and still calling her Butterfly. That was all that mattered. Her mother had invited them to Christmas dinner, insisting it was a tradition they had started the year before, and both Jack and Jane had eagerly agreed. The entire town of Winter Creek had been overjoyed to learn that Jane had returned, and everyone had believed her tale about testing out wigs for Jack. No one ever needed to know the truth about her return to Winter Creek. Mama, can I help you with the cooking? Jane asked from her position on the sofa in the living room. Not at all. I invited you over, So I do the cooking, Ruth insisted. I'll go fetch some more wood for the fireplace, Jack said, taking to his feet. Jane appreciated that whenever they came over, Jack offered to do chores that she knew her father was finding harder to do with his ailing leg. It was the small things that Jack did that made her fall in love with him all over again. Every day, her father followed Jack outside, moving much slower than Jack. Jane stood up and joined her mother in the kitchen. Please let me help. I can't just sit here while you do all the work. Can I set the table for you? No. Ruth firmly shook her head. You can head to your old bedroom and unpack that chest. I've a feeling you might be needing what's inside. You already gave me my Christmas gift. The hat is simply lovely, Mama. You don't need to give me anything else. So is the brooch you gave me, but that doesn't mean I won't be asking for a hug later. Now go on. Go unpack that chest. Jane knew that arguing with her mother was useless when her mother had her mind set. Jane couldn't remember what was stored in the chest in front of her old bed, but she would unpack it if it meant so much to her mother. Perhaps it held her old clothes or personal items she might have kept in the hopes of Jane returning. A frown creased Jane's brow when she walked into her old bedroom. She couldn't help but wonder why her mother had waited a year before she suggested Jane go through her chest of childhood belongings. She kneeled in front of the chest and opened the heavy lid. Right at the top was a quilt that Jane recognized as the one that once covered her bed. Her mother had sewed it herself. She lifted the quilt to her face and took a deep breath. It smelt of pine and dust, but the texture was familiar. Jane set the quilt aside and saw what was underneath it. A gasp escaped her as she lifted the baby booties from the chest. They were in great condition, the lace still white as snow where it frilled the top. Next, she spotted a baby's all-on-one, also in good condition. Jane kept unpacking baby items for the next 15 minutes. Everything from blankets, shoes, hats, coats, and even the complete layette for a cot. Once the entire bed was covered with baby items, there was a soft knock at the door. Jane turned and saw her mother standing in the doorway with a cocked brow and a teasing smile. All those belong to you. Never knew why I kept them until today. Why did you? Jane asked, shaking her head in confusion. She'd been gone for almost 6 years. How was her mother to ever know she'd come back? I hoped that this day would come. I prayed for it, Ruth admitted, moving towards Jane. For the day you would need it for your own baby. Jane's eyes widened. How did you... We haven't told anyone, Ruth nodded. A woman knows and recognizes it in another. When you're a mother, you'll recognize it as well. How far along are you? Jane laughed, even as her eyes welled with tears of joy. The doctor says I'm due in summer, so not very far. That's far enough to start telling people. And if you don't want to, at least allow Jack to tell people. The way he's hovering over you will make people think you've got a terminal illness. Jane couldn't help but chuckle. I didn't know it was that obvious. Jack's hovering or your persistent glow? Ruth asked with a wink. I'm so happy for you, Jane. Becoming a mother, it's the most wonderful experience that the Lord can bless us with. From the moment you hold that baby in your arms, you love it more than life itself. You'll do anything to protect it, everything to make it happy. And you'll make mistakes, lots of them. But that's all right, too. Jane felt her heart swell with love for her mother. Now that she was becoming a mother herself, she finally found herself understanding her parents' reasoning from all those years ago. And even if they leave, you'll pray for them every night and hope that one day they return to you. Exactly, Ruth agreed. Come on, I hear the men are back. Prosody %. Ruth and Jane had barely finished returning all the items to the chest when Peter's voice rung through the house. Ruth, we're going to be grandparents. Jane and her mother looked at each other before they both burst out laughing. When they joined Peter and Jack in the living room, Jack smiled at Jane apologetically. I'm sorry, I know you wanted to wait, but I couldn't. Jane laughed. It's all right, Jack, my mother knows as well. She figured it out by herself. You did? Jack asked, surprised. She did, because apparently you're hovering over me. Ruth laughed. And how grateful am I to have a son-in-law who hovers over my daughter. Is the dinner ready yet? Peter asked once the congratulations had been said. Ruth clucked her tongue. You can wait a little longer. Can we at least enjoy Christmas first? Christmas is about the food, isn't it? How can I enjoy Christmas without the food? Peter teased. Jane, Jack, and Ruth laughed at Peter's question because no one understood better than this family what the true meaning of Christmas truly was. Christmas wasn't about the gifts, the feast of food, or even the decorations on the tree. Christmas was about the company of loved ones, forgiveness, gratitude, and most of all, it was about love. Jane turned to Jack and saw in his gaze exactly what she felt in her heart. Love without limitations, a love that brought hope and the promise of a bright future. Ruth turned to Jane with a pretend sigh. Perhaps you need to help me with dinner after all. Jane chuckled as she followed her mother into the kitchen.